What you are about to witness is a fascinating interview with a gentleman called Christopher Spencer, or rather that is his pen name. He has to conceal his real name. In the following interview, Christopher speaks about his 50 plus years in the world of high-level finance, both as a banker and a finance and investment broker. He covers everything from international espionage to covert financial agreements, conmen, murder, war, and more, with a touch of personal flair. Everything you are about to hear is true. Some questions were pre-agreed and scripted to explain specific content in his books. Most are not. You can find details of where to buy his books in the video description below. This is part 7. Post-lunch question 11 underway. Your next two true stories are about two major construction projects. What was your role in trying to get these projects run for your employer? How did you do that?
Well, my job was to find the money for the projects, otherwise they wouldn't have gone ahead, obviously. And one was a major project in Turkey, which was a new suspension bridge over the Bosphorus in Istanbul. And I had to work fairly hard on that to put together a banking consortium to provide the finance for the Turkish government, who were going to pay for that project. The second project was a privatized toll road in Indonesia. Now, this was the beginning of the period of privatized projects, where projects were not funded by the government or guaranteed by the government, but the construction company had to find the money for the project themselves, and then they were repaid for doing that by the income that the project generated. The privatized project program is, of course, much more difficult to finance than anything that was guaranteed by a government. My first role in both of those projects also was to be the first or second person from my company to go out there and make an assessment of the situation, to understand how the country worked, to understand its financial structure, to find out how tax worked in the country, how the legal system worked, and generally provide what was known as a country report, which then guided us through as to how to set up the companies we had to set up in the country concerned, and how to deal with the various legal, financial and tax situations in that particular country that we would find ourselves in.
Okay, number 12. In your story set in Turkey, you appear very blasé, very indifferent to the fact that you and your colleagues were under constant Turkish government surveillance. How did you manage not to be worried by this situation? Obviously, we have discussed it a little bit already.
Yeah.
But please,
there's something specific here.
Yeah.
Well, I was very fortunate. I actually asked for one man to come with me, and I was given what I called a mission impossible. I had several of those at the time, and that was to try and win the bid for our consortium of companies, when in fact our bid was about, I think it was about $500 million, $500 million more expensive than the competing bid. So that was mission impossible. And I took with me a man who had a very, very good brain and had worked behind the Iron Curtain in the countries of Eastern Europe. I took him because his brain was really capable of processing things very, very quickly, and secondly, of coming up with solutions. And we traveled together to Ankara, the capital city of Turkey, and we spent quite a few weeks there trying to win this project for us. During the time that I was there, I was very conscious of the fact that I was under Turkish government surveillance all the time, and the fact that my colleague was very used to that in Eastern Europe when he used to travel there, obviously working with the communist regimes there that were then in power. I suppose that made me accept this surveillance situation, and in fact we constructed it so that we actually use that. So we fed information on the telephone through, which was some of it was false, some of it was true, and we formed that information so it would be advantage to us, and we knew that agents of the Turkish government were listening to our telephone conversations. So that was actually quite a useful exercise in using surveillance to your advantage.
Question 13. From your next story set in Indonesia, I realised that you had done something rather special. You had really invented something novel in the way that finance could be done there. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, privatized projects are a problem, particularly when you're doing them in a developing country like Indonesia. The reason for that is that banks are very willing to lend to the governments of these countries, but when in fact it's a privatized project and there's no money or no guarantee from government, it then becomes a really private sector situation, and international banks are very uncertain about lending in such situations. Now, for every project, there's a UK content, that is material or equipment or labour, expertise coming from the UK. And then there's the local content, which is materials like cement and the workers that have to be paid on the construction, hiring of equipment there probably as well. So that's the local content. I managed to get the British government to support the British portion of our proposed bid. They did that with export credit and with some aid money. So that covered the British portion. But when it came to the Indonesian portion of the financing, it was completely impossible. The international bank said no, they wouldn't lend to a private project in Indonesia. So I had to find a solution to that. I looked at the finance market, generally the financial infrastructure in Indonesia, and it was very clear there was very little for people to invest in, particularly the companies like insurance companies or pension funds. And they had to meet their long-term obligations, like paying out pensions in about 20 years' time. And they really needed long-term assets, giving them a good return over that 20-year period in order to pay the pensions of people in the future. Their choice of assets was very limited. They could put money on deposit with banks, and they didn't get a very good return on that. There was a small government bond market, but again, they were only 5-year bonds and the interest rates weren't very attractive. So I came up with an idea that I'd seen had been done in Australia, which was to issue a bond issue, which the return on which was linked to the income of the actual project concerned. And this was a new tunnel under Sydney Harbour. I met with the Australian bank involved. I kind of perfected my ideas, and then I went to Indonesia and started talking to the Indonesian government and various institutions there about a income-related bond issue, the income related to the income on the toll road. And obviously every vehicle on the toll road, depending on whether it was a car or a truck, was going to pay a toll. And that toll would probably be linked to inflation. So over the years, this flow of money would be coming in linked to inflation, and it would be obviously profitable because the costs of maintaining a toll road are there, but it wouldn't be as much as the tolls that we were getting in. So after a profit for that company, there would be an excess left over to pay to bondholders who had bought this income-related bond issue. The fact is that the Indonesian institution, like the insurance companies and the pension fund, welcomed this as a wonderful development. It I really indulged in financial engineering, and it developed the Indonesian financial market. And they said that they would underwrite, they would buy the whole of this issue. Now, unfortunately, the project didn't happen, and we didn't win it for my company or for Britain. But nevertheless, the Indonesians then adopted my proposal on financing for that project when they did it some years later, and then for every other privatized road project that they then did. So I left my mark there, if you like, in order to be able Indonesia to develop into the next set of privatized projects, helping the country to do that, and also helping the financial market in Indonesia to find a new way of investing funds and getting the long-term returns that they needed.
So in regards to that, you say, oh, I met with an Australian bank to perfect my ideas, etc. How do you just meet with a bank and get them to discuss things with you like that?
Well, it's down to contacts, really. A good friend of mine, who is still a friend, I met around about that period. He is a very clever chap, and he was working for the Australian bank in its, he was running a senior position in the Australian bank in its London branch. And we met, and he told me about the project, the new Sydney Harbour Tunnel. And I said, well, that's very interesting. Tell me more about it. And then told him in confidence what I was trying to do. And he very kindly arranged for me to meet up with his colleagues in Sydney. And I travelled out to Sydney, and I spent a week with them. And they very kindly introduced me to various people in Australia, including the New South Wales government that was sponsoring the project, including people within the local Sydney Council, and various other people they were using on this particular project, including the company that was estimating how many vehicles would be going through the new tunnel once it was built. And then they built up this financial model dependent upon the number of vehicles, coupled with the toll rate, and found out what the income of the new project would be. Perfectly estimated. And of course, in the end, we had to do something similar in Indonesia. They helped us on that. And then they benefited in due course from a consultancy contract from the Indonesian government in order to perfect these types of projects and their financing in the future.
They invested their time in you because your contact knew what you were capable of, knew the level at which you worked, and trusted you. And they invested their time to help you, probably with full knowledge that it may pay off for them in the end as well. So I assume that kind of thing happened often for you?
Yes, I mean, I got them over to Jakarta, and we had a full one-day conference on this. The audience was, chairman and managing directors of leading financial institutions and also government officials as well, because they wanted to hear how this was going to be done. The help that I got, the informal help that I got from bankers was amazing, actually. Obviously, we were a big client or big potential client, and they were very happy to talk to me. But they always talked informally. Very often, they always said this: "We're going to tell you something that's very confidential." When I faced a problem in a particular country or for a particular financing situation, I used to contact one of them, shall we say, do you know this gentleman in Turkey, for example? And the answer came back, well, yes, we do. I wouldn't touch him with a barge pole if I were you. And obviously that information came to me in strict confidence. And what you must not do is to ever break that confidence, because then you would never be trusted and people would not help you in that way. It's a quid pro quo. That's the way that life works at that kind of level.
So that goes back to my earlier question about it's good networking.
Good networking, but it's all about trust. It's good networking, but it's all about trust.
I mean, that's reflective of all the facets of life. We have those that are untrustworthy, and the rest of us try and stick together. Basically,
I think if you're trusted, you learn lot more about people. You can also learn a lot more about situations, and certain people in certain countries entrusted me with information that was useful, and obviously you bring that back to Britain, and if you think it's of interest to the government, you will tell the government. Again, it's a question that you will never be identified in giving that information.